I was standing in my driveway, my breath turning into little clouds in the freezing air, when I tore open an envelope stamped "Final Notice" from my HOA. It was December 30th, 2 days before New Year's Eve, and according to them, I was already out of chances. The letter said my home was in serious violation and warned that fines would start piling up at $500 per day beginning January 1st, all over holiday lights. Not blinking, not colorful, not oversized. Just clean, warm, white lights, steady and simple, professionally installed. The same exact lights I had put up every single December for 8 years straight without a single warning or complaint. But this year was different. The letter was signed by the HOA president, Denise Caldwell, and it included photos taken at night from across the street, zoomed in like evidence in a courtroom. That's when it hit me. This had nothing to do with rules or regulations. This was personal. As I stood there holding that letter, my kids watching quietly from the window, something inside me snapped. If the HOA thought they could threaten my family and ruin our holidays, I decided right then and there that they were going to regret it before the year was over. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I live in a small neighborhood called Willow Ridge, just outside the quiet, fictional town of Maple Hollow, Indiana. It's the kind of place people move to because they're tired of noise and chaos. Neighbors wave when you drive by. Kids ride their bikes in the street without parents panicking. After a snowstorm, someone always clears a sidewalk for the elderly couple on the corner before they even ask. That sense of calm is exactly why my wife, Laura, and I bought our home here almost a decade ago. We wanted stability, a place where our kids could grow up feeling safe. For most of those years, the HOA barely registered in my mind. It existed, sure, but only in the most harmless way. They took care of the shared landscaping, sent out a boring newsletter every few months, and reminded people about pool hours in the summer. Nobody worried about them. Nobody feared them. They were just there. That all changed about a year earlier. Denise Caldwell moved into the neighborhood after what everyone whispered was a messy divorce. From the moment she showed up at her first HOA meeting, she made it clear she had opinions. Strong ones. She talked nonstop about declining standards and loss of neighborhood pride, even though nothing had actually changed. Lawns were still neat, houses were still well kept. But Denise acted like Willow Ridge was on the brink of collapse. When she became HOA president, things shifted almost immediately. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Friendly reminder emails about trash cans needing to be pulled in by evening. Notes about making sure grass didn't exceed the approved height. Mildly annoying, but nothing outrageous. Then the tone changed. The reminders became warnings. The warnings became fines, and the fines were often announced publicly during HOA meetings with names attached, like some kind of humiliation ritual. Neighbors started whispering to each other. People who had lived here longer than I had said they'd never seen anything like it. Denise seemed to enjoy the authority. She spoke sharply, cut people off, and dismissed concerns with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Even then, I figured it would blow over. I kept my head down. I followed the rules. I didn't attend meetings unless I had to. As long as she stayed out of my business, I was content to ignore her. That worked right up until December. Every year, without fail, I put up the same holiday lights, nothing flashy. No blinking patterns, no giant decorations. Just warm white string lights along the roofline and porch, clean, simple, tasteful. The same setup I had used for 8 straight years. Not once had anyone complained. Not once had I received so much as a warning. And just to be safe, I checked the HOA guidelines anyway. Decorations were explicitly allowed from Thanksgiving through January 5th. I read it twice. Then a third time. There was no gray area. So when the violation letter showed up, my first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. I honestly assumed it had been sent to the wrong house. I emailed the HOA management company that same afternoon. I kept my message polite and professional. I attached screenshots of the relevant rules. I explained that my decorations complied fully and asked for clarification. No response. The next morning, I opened my front door and found another notice taped directly to it. Same violation. Same accusation. Only this time, the language was harsher. The consequences more severe. That was the moment my confusion turned into concern. Laura read the notice, then quietly looked out the window toward the end of the street. She stood there for a moment before calling me over. "Have you noticed Denise's house lately?" she asked. I hadn't. Not really. But once I looked, I couldn't unsee it. 2 streets over, Denise's house was lit up like something out of a holiday commercial. Bright blue lights wrapped every inch of her roof. Animated snowflakes projected across her garage. A massive glowing reindeer stood proudly in her front yard, visible from half the neighborhood. It was impossible to miss, and yet, somehow, she hadn't received a single violation. No warning, no fine. Nothing. That was when the truth finally settled in. This wasn't about holiday lights. This was about control. About power. About who Denise decided deserved to be punished and who didn't. And once I realized that, I knew the problem wasn't going to go away on its own. I tried to handle everything the calm, reasonable way first, because that's the kind of person I am. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't fire off angry emails. I picked up the phone and called the HOA management office. It went straight to voicemail. I left a message explaining the situation and asking for clarification. No response. I called again later that afternoon. Same thing. Voicemail. Over the next day, I left 3 messages and sent 2 follow-up emails. Finally, I got a reply, short, cold, and clearly written to shut me up. The message said the board had full discretion over aesthetic violations and that my decorations had been deemed non-compliant. That was it. No explanation. No reference to a specific rule. Nothing. I wrote back immediately and asked a simple question. What exact rule had I violated? They never answered that. Instead, the pressure started to build. On December 31st, right in the middle of the day when most people were focused on New Year's plans, an email landed in my inbox with the subject line written entirely in capital letters. It informed me that fines would be applied retroactively if I did not comply immediately. The word immediately was bolded 3 separate times, like they thought intimidation worked better when you emphasized it. They weren't just threatening future fines. They were threatening to go back and charge me for days that had already passed. That was when the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding and started feeling like harassment. What hurt the most, though, wasn't the money or the threats. It was my kids. They overheard Laura and me talking in the kitchen, and later that night my youngest asked me, very quietly, if Santa wasn't going to come because we might have to take the lights down. That question hit harder than any email or letter ever could. I decided I wasn't going to handle this over email anymore. If Denise wanted to push this, she was going to have to look me in the eye. That evening, I attended what the HOA called an emergency meeting. When I walked into the room, I could feel the tension immediately. Denise sat at the front table, perfectly composed, hands folded, wearing a tight smile that looked more like satisfaction than professionalism. 2 other board members sat beside her, staring down at their papers like they hoped no one would notice them. When it was time for homeowners to speak, I raised my hand and calmly explained that my decorations followed the guidelines exactly. I barely got halfway through my sentence before Denise cut me off. "These lights detract from neighborhood uniformity," she said sharply, her voice echoing slightly in the room. "And frankly, they're excessive. Excessive." The word hung there, absurd and insulting. I took a breath and pointed out, calmly, that the guidelines allowed decorations through January 5th, and that my lights were far less noticeable than others in the neighborhood. I didn't even have to name names. But Denise did. She smiled and said, "Mine were approved." That's when I asked the question everyone else was clearly thinking but too afraid to say out loud. Approved by who? She didn't hesitate. The board. Except she was the board. She was the one making the decisions. And everyone in that room knew it. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Chairs shifted. Someone cleared their throat. A few neighbors stared at the floor. Others looked at Denise, then back at me, like they were watching something they'd waited a long time to see. I realized then that no one had ever openly challenged her before. They had complained privately. They had vented to each other, but no one had confronted her publicly. The meeting wrapped up quickly after that. No resolution. No compromise. Just more vague statements about discretion and compliance. As people filed out, Denise stepped closer to me. Her voice dropped low enough that only I could hear her. "If you think you can push back," she said, her smile gone now, "you're going to have a very expensive new year." There was no mistaking the threat. I walked out of that meeting feeling something I hadn't felt before. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was resolve. Up until that moment, I had been trying to prove I was right. Now, I knew that wasn't enough. Denise didn't care about being right or wrong. She cared about control. And standing there in the parking lot, cold air biting at my face, I made a decision of my own. If she wanted a fight, she was about to learn that I wasn't nearly as powerless as she thought. That night, I didn't touch the lights. I didn't even consider it. Instead, after the kids were in bed and the house finally went quiet, I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of printed HOA documents I hadn't looked at in years. If Denise wanted to play hardball, I was done guessing. I wanted facts. I started with the bylaws. Not the summary, not the friendly handbook. The full document. Page after page of dense language that most people never bother to read. I went line by line, highlighting anything that mentioned enforcement, discretion, approvals, or penalties. It took hours, and more than once I almost missed it. Almost. Buried deep in the section on architectural and aesthetic standards was a clause that stopped me cold. Any approval, temporary or permanent, had to be documented in writing and retained in HOA records. No verbal approvals. No informal sign-offs. No exceptions. I read it again just to be sure. That meant Denise's claim that her decorations were approved only mattered if there was actual paperwork to prove it. And something told me there wasn't. The next morning, I filed a formal records request with the HOA management company. Nothing dramatic. Just a clear, polite request asking for copies of any approvals issued for holiday decorations in the past 3 years, including those granted to board members. I expected resistance. What I didn't expect was how fast the tone changed. 2 days later, an email landed in my inbox. Short. Careful. Almost nervous. Attached were several documents, approvals for a handful of homes over the years. Denise's name wasn't on any of them. Not once. No approval for her lights. No approval for her projections. No approval for the massive glowing reindeer that dominated her front yard every December. She had lied, boldly, publicly, without hesitation. And that wasn't even the worst part. As I reviewed the rest of the records, something else started to stand out. A category labeled Special Beautification Fund. It sounded harmless enough at first, but when I looked closer, the numbers didn't make sense. The fund was almost entirely made up of fines, not evenly distributed fines either. They came from the same small group of homeowners, over and over again. I recognized some of the names. One of them was Tom Reynolds. Tom lived 3 houses down from me. Quiet guy. Retired accountant. Retired accountant. Always friendly. Always meticulous. He had been fined multiple times for what the HOA called a non-compliant mailbox, even though his mailbox had been approved years earlier. I knocked on his door that afternoon. When I explained what I'd found, he didn't look surprised. He sighed, stepped aside, and invited me in. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. Inside were letters, warnings, fines, and emails, all from the HOA. "They never give me the same reason twice," he said. But the fines never stop. We sat at his dining table and compared notes, dates, amounts, reasons. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. The same homeowners were being fined repeatedly. The violations were vague. The enforcement was inconsistent. And the money kept flowing into that same special fund. A fund Denise controlled. Tom did the math faster than I could. Over the past few years, tens of thousands of dollars had been collected under the guise of beautification. And there was no clear record of how it was spent. This wasn't strict rule enforcement. This was selective punishment. I started reaching out quietly to other neighbors. Not accusing, just asking questions. What I heard back made my stomach drop. People had paid fines they didn't understand because they were afraid. Afraid of retaliation. Afraid of escalating costs. Afraid of becoming the next target. Some had stopped decorating altogether. Others avoided meetings. A few were even considering selling their homes just to escape the stress. Denise hadn't just created rules, she had created fear. And suddenly everything made sense. The threats. The confidence. The way she spoke to people like she was untouchable. She wasn't enforcing standards. She was using the HOA as a personal weapon. By the time I went back home that evening, the lights were still glowing softly along my roofline. For the first time since this started, I didn't feel anxious looking at them. I felt focused, because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I had documents, records, patterns, proof. Denise thought she had all the power because no one ever pushed back. But the truth was, she had been careless, and she had underestimated the one thing she couldn't control. Someone willing to read the fine print. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because I was angry, but because I finally had leverage. I didn't confront Denise. Not yet. Everything in me wanted to, but I knew better. Confrontation would only tip her off and give her time to cover her tracks. So instead, I did the one thing she didn't expect. I went quiet. No emails. No calls. No angry responses. From the outside, it probably looked like I had backed down, like the pressure had worked. But behind the scenes, I was doing the exact opposite. I filed the formal appeal, carefully written and impossible to dismiss. I cited specific sections of the bylaws, quoted them word for word, and attached documentation showing that my decorations were fully compliant. I requested, in writing, copies of any approvals related to holiday decorations, especially those involving board members. Then I took it a step further. I requested a financial audit. It was a right every homeowner had, clearly spelled out in the governing documents, but almost no one ever used it. I made sure to reference that section too. And instead of sending it quietly to management, I copied the entire board. That's when the panic started. Within hours, my inbox exploded. Emails from the management company asking for clarification. Messages from board members requesting time to review. Notices that previously scheduled meetings were suddenly postponed. The calm, confident authority Denise had projected for months vanished overnight. Then she lashed out. I received an email directly from Denise accusing me of harassment, intimidation, and undermining community harmony. The irony was almost laughable. She warned that my actions could result in further penalties if I didn't cease immediately. I didn't respond, because by then the audit was already underway. When the results came back, they were worse than I expected. The audit revealed that over the past 3 years, Denise had reimbursed herself HOA funds for what she labeled holiday decorations. Thousands of dollars. Every single December. Lights, projections, yard displays, all paid for using money collected from homeowner fines. Money that was supposed to go towards shared landscaping and community improvements. There were no approvals, no votes, no disclosures, just Denise helping herself. I sat there staring at the report, feeling equal parts stunned and vindicated. This wasn't just unethical. It was a clear abuse of authority. I didn't blast the information publicly. I didn't post it online. I did something far more effective. I shared it with my neighbors. Quiet conversations at first. Printed copies slid across kitchen tables. Screenshots shown on phones. One by one, people realized they weren't alone. That the fines they had paid weren't random. That the stress they'd endured wasn't imagined. Once the dam broke, the stories poured out. A single mother fined repeatedly for leaving a stroller on her porch. An elderly couple threatened over lawn ornaments. A family cited for noise during a birthday party in the middle of the afternoon. People talked about being cornered after meetings, spoken to harshly, warned not to complain. Fear had kept everyone isolated. Information brought them together. By the end of the week, Denise wasn't just dealing with me anymore. She was dealing with the entire neighborhood. The board had no choice. An emergency meeting was scheduled, and this time, the notice didn't feel routine. It felt urgent. It felt serious. And when the night arrived, something was different. The room was full. Not just the usual handful of attendees, but dozens of homeowners. People standing along the walls. Couples sitting shoulder to shoulder. Neighbors who had never spoken at a meeting before, now whispering to each other, holding documents in their hands. Denise arrived late. She took her seat at the front, but the confidence was gone. The smiles were gone. She avoided eye contact as the meeting was called to order. For the first time since she became president, Denise wasn't in control of the room, and everyone there knew it. The atmosphere in that meeting room was nothing like it had been before. The air felt heavy, tight, like everyone was holding their breath at the same time. Denise sat at the front with her shoulders squared, trying to project confidence, but it wasn't working. You could see it in her eyes. She knew this was different. She opened the meeting with a long, rehearsed statement about misinformation and personal attacks, framing everything as an attempt to undermine her leadership. She spoke quickly, barely pausing, as if she could outrun the truth by talking faster than anyone else. It didn't work. When homeowner comments opened, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I didn't need to. I laid everything out slowly and clearly. Dates, amounts, copies of bylaws, the audit report, reimbursement records labeled holiday decorations. I passed documents down the rows so people could see for themselves. Denise interrupted me more than once, but each time I simply waited until she finished and continued. The room stayed quiet. People were listening, really listening, really listening. Then others stood up. Tom spoke next, explaining how he had been fined repeatedly for the same mailbox, despite having written approval. A young couple described receiving threats over chalk drawings their kids had left on the driveway. An older woman's voice shook as she explained how she'd paid fines she couldn't afford because she was afraid of losing her home. Each story added weight. Each one chipped away at the version of events Denise was desperately trying to maintain. She started snapping back, accusing people of exaggerating, of coordinating, of lying. Her composure cracked further with every accusation. The more she spoke, the worse it sounded. At one point, she slammed her hand on the table and said, "This is turning into a witch hunt." That's when one of the board members finally spoke up. "If that's true," he said quietly, "then the paperwork should clear this up." It didn't. The evidence was undeniable. The room knew it. The board knew it. And Denise knew it. She stood up suddenly, knocking her chair backward. She accused everyone of ganging up on her, of betraying her, of trying to humiliate her. Her voice rose, sharp and emotional, echoing off the walls. Halfway through her rant, she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room, heels clicking angrily down the hallway. The door slammed behind her. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the board chair cleared his throat and called for order. The discussion that followed was quiet, serious, and completely unlike any HOA meeting I had ever attended. Motions were made. Procedures were followed. Votes were taken. By the end of the night, Denise's authority as HOA president was formally suspended, pending a full investigation. Just like that, the power she had wielded so freely was gone. As the meeting wrapped up, several neighbors came over to thank me. Some shook my hand. Others just nodded, like words weren't enough. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. When I pulled into my driveway later that night, the white lights were still glowing softly against the dark sky. No new notices, no threats taped to my door, no fines. My lights stayed up. But standing there in the quiet, I knew something else too. This wasn't over yet. Denise might have lost her position, but the investigation had only just begun. And whatever came next, whatever else the truth uncovered, was going to be far bigger than a string of holiday lights. The real climax was still coming. January 3rd started like any other winter morning, gray and quiet, but by noon my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Text messages came in from neighbors, one after another, all saying the same thing. Denise had resigned. No speech, no apology, no explanation, just a short, carefully worded email sent to the board and forwarded to the neighborhood later that afternoon. She cited personal reasons and claimed the stress of recent events had made it impossible for her to continue. After everything she had put people through, the understatement was almost insulting. But it didn't end there. Her resignation didn't stop the investigation. If anything, it sped it up. 2 days later, the HOA attorney held a special meeting and laid everything out in plain terms. Improperly issued fines would be refunded. Every single one. A new oversight structure would be implemented immediately. No single board member would ever again have unilateral control over enforcement or finances. Approvals would require documentation, votes would be recorded, and audits would become routine instead of optional. People sat there in stunned silence as the scope of it all became clear. This wasn't just about one bad president. It was about a system that had allowed fear and secrecy to replace accountability. Then came the announcement no one expected to hear out loud. The HOA itself was filing a civil suit against Denise. Not a symbolic gesture, a real lawsuit. The goal was to recover the funds she had misused over the years, money taken from homeowners under the guise of fines and quietly reimbursed to herself. Thousands of dollars. Possibly more, depending on what the final accounting revealed. I remember looking around the room and seeing expressions I hadn't seen in a long time. Relief, shock, vindication. For some people, there were tears. For others, just long exhaled breaths, like they had been holding tension in their chests for years without realizing it. The irony of it all didn't take long to surface. As part of the investigation, an independent compliance review was conducted on recent violations, including holiday decorations. And wouldn't you know it, Denise's house didn't meet the standards she had enforced so aggressively on everyone else. Her blue lights exceeded brightness guidelines. The animated projections weren't permitted at all. The massive glowing reindeer violated size restrictions that she herself had cited when fining another homeowner the previous year. Every single decoration she had proudly displayed was officially documented as a violation. No discretion, no approval, no exception. That detail spread through the neighborhood faster than anything else. People laughed about it in driveways. They shook their heads in disbelief. Some said it felt unreal, like a story you'd hear secondhand and assume had to be exaggerated. But it was real. All of it. Denise never showed her face at another HOA meeting. Not once. She didn't respond to emails. She didn't defend herself publicly. Her house went dark early that winter, decorations taken down in silence. By spring, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. When she finally moved out, there was no farewell. No goodbye. Just an empty driveway and a chapter quietly closing. The neighborhood felt different almost immediately. Lighter. Safer. Conversations returned to normal things, school events, weather, weekend plans, instead of fines and threats. Kids played outside again without parents worrying about being cited for chalk or noise. Decorations came back. Not just holiday ones, but porch plants, flags, little expressions of personality that had slowly disappeared under Denise's rule. One evening, as I stood outside taking down my lights well within the allowed time frame, a neighbor walked by and said, "You know, this all started because you didn't back down." I thought about that for a moment. It wasn't really about the lights. It never was. It was about what happens when someone mistakes authority for ownership, and when a community forgets it has a voice. Denise believed fear would keep people quiet. She believed no one would read the bylaws. No one would ask questions. No one would challenge her. She was wrong. And in the end, the very rules she used to intimidate others became the reason she lost everything she tried to control. That's what made it poetic. Not revenge, not humiliation. Justice. The change didn't happen all at once, but it was noticeable almost immediately. It was like a heavy weight had been lifted off the neighborhood, something most of us hadn't even realized we were carrying until it was gone. The tension that used to hang over Willow Ridge slowly dissolved, replaced by a sense of relief and, surprisingly, optimism. Transparency became the new standard. The board opened its meetings fully to homeowners and posted detailed minutes afterward. Financial reports were shared openly, not buried in vague summaries. Questions were welcomed instead of brushed aside. For the first time in a long while, the HOA felt like what it was supposed to be, a service to the community, not a threat hanging over it. New board elections were held within weeks. Several longtime residents stepped up, people known more for helping neighbors than policing them. I was asked more than once if I wanted to run, but I declined. I didn't want power. I just wanted fairness. Still, I agreed to help in another way. I worked with the new board to rewrite the enforcement policies from the ground up. We stripped out vague language and replaced it with clear, measurable standards. Discretion was limited. Documentation was mandatory. Appeals had timelines. No more surprise fines. No more whispered threats. Everything had to be in writing, visible to anyone who asked. It was slow work, but it felt right. At home, the mood changed too. My kids noticed it before I did. They stopped asking whether we were in trouble every time the doorbell rang. They helped me check the calendar and proudly counted down the days until January 5th, knowing that was the last day our lights were allowed to stay up. And they stayed up. Every single evening until January 5th, our house glowed softly, just as it always had. No notices appeared on the door. No emails arrived. No fines threatened to ruin dinner. The lights were no longer a point of stress. They were just lights again. Neighbors started smiling more, waving again, stopping to talk instead of rushing inside. Decorations slowly returned to porches and yards, not just for holidays, but for everyday life. Wind chimes, flower pots, welcome signs, small things that had quietly disappeared when everyone was afraid of drawing attention. One afternoon, I saw Tom working on his mailbox, not replacing it, just repainting it, the same way he'd always wanted to. He caught me watching and laughed. "First time I've touched this thing in years without worrying about a fine," he said. That's when it really sank in. Fear had shaped our behavior more than we realized. It had made us smaller, quieter, less ourselves. The HOA learned a hard lesson through all of this. Power without accountability doesn't create order, it creates resentment. Rules without fairness don't build community, they tear it apart. And authority only works when it's grounded in trust. Willow Ridge wasn't perfect after that. No neighborhood ever is, but it was healthier, stronger. People felt comfortable speaking up again. And when issues came up, they were handled openly, not behind closed doors. As winter gave way to spring, the neighborhood felt reborn in a subtle, meaningful way. Kids rode their bikes again. Families gathered outside. People remembered why they moved here in the first place, all because one person decided not to stay quiet. All because a string of holiday lights became a reminder that rules are meant to serve people, not control them. And that was a lesson none of us would forget. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize I never set out to fight anyone. I wasn't trying to make a statement or start a rebellion. All I wanted was to enjoy the holidays with my family in the home we worked hard to buy. I wanted my kids to feel safe, happy, and excited this time of year, not worried about letters taped to the door or adults arguing over rules that were never meant to hurt anyone. But sometimes, standing up isn't a choice you make calmly. Sometimes it's the only option you're left with. When the people in power forget who they serve, staying quiet only teaches them that fear works. The HOA thought a single letter would scare me into compliance. Instead, it exposed everything they were trying to hide. It revealed how easily authority can turn into abuse when no one questions it, and how quickly things change when someone finally does. If there's one lesson I hope this story leaves you with, it's this: read the rules for yourself, know your rights, ask questions, and never assume that someone in charge automatically has integrity just because they hold a title. Because sometimes it's the smallest spark, something as simple as a string of white holiday lights, that shines a light on an entire broken system. And once that light is on, it's impossible to ignore what's really going on. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?